In a quiet neighborhood on Cleveland's west side, surrounded by ordinary streets and modern life, stands a house that does not belong to its surroundings. It is large, Gothic, heavy with stone and shadow. Its towers rise above the trees like watchful silhouettes. Its windows feel less like openings and more like eyes. This is Franklin Castle. Unlike many infamous American houses, Franklin Castle was never isolated. It was never hidden in the countryside. It was built in the middle of a growing city, among neighbors, churches, and schools. Its darkness did not come from distance. It came from within. The house was constructed in the late 19th century for a German immigrant named Hannes Tiedemann. He was a successful businessman, disciplined, private, and ambitious. By outward appearances, he was the embodiment of stability and respectability. But almost immediately after the house was completed, death began to arrive. Not suddenly, not dramatically, relentlessly. Within a few years, multiple members of the Tiedemann family died inside the castle. Children first, then adults. Illnesses that progressed quickly, conditions that were poorly explained, loss after loss, concentrated within the same walls. Neighbors noticed the pattern. Funeral processions became familiar sights on Franklin Boulevard. Curtains were drawn more often than opened. The house that had once symbolized success began to feel closed, secretive, and heavy. Then came the rumors. Some said hidden rooms existed behind the walls. Others spoke of sealed passages, bricked-over corridors, and doors that led to spaces no one was meant to enter. The house's unusual architecture, its turrets, hidden staircases, and thick walls, fed the imagination. Franklin Castle began to feel less like a home and more like a container, a place where something was being kept. By the time Hannes Tiedemann himself died, the house had already acquired a reputation. It was whispered about, avoided, and watched. New owners came and went. None stayed long. Each departure added another layer to the story. Deaths continued. Tragedies accumulated. Explanations thinned. Over time, Franklin Castle stopped being associated with a single family and became something larger. A symbol of concentrated loss. A structure around which stories naturally formed because silence demanded filling. Children in the neighborhood dared each other to approach it at night. Adults lowered their voices when speaking its name. Windows were rumored to glow after dark. Sounds were reported from empty rooms. Whether these stories were true did not matter. What mattered was that the house endured them. Franklin Castle did not deny its reputation. It absorbed it. Each generation added another detail, another rumor, another explanation for the unease the building inspired. And that unease was real. Because unlike distant ruins or abandoned mansions, Franklin Castle remained occupied, sold, reused, and returned to again and again. It never had the chance to fade quietly into obscurity. It stayed present. And presence is dangerous when a place carries unresolved grief. By the early 20th century, Franklin Castle was no longer just a house with a tragic past. It was becoming something else. A story that refused to end. A structure that collected meaning the way it had once collected loss. And the deeper people looked into its history, the more uncomfortable the answers became. Because some stories are not built on myth. They are built on patterns. After the death of Hannes Tiedemann, the house did not empty. It changed. Without the original family inside, Franklin Castle lost the last barrier between private tragedy and public imagination. Curtains that had once concealed grief were pulled back, and the house became visible in a way it never had been before. New occupants moved in, and almost immediately, the stories intensified. Neighbors claimed the atmosphere around the house felt heavier. Not darker in a theatrical sense, but oppressive, as if sound behaved differently near its walls. Footsteps echoed longer. Voices seemed muted. The castle did not blend into the street. It dominated it. With each new resident, rumors accumulated instead of fading. People spoke of hidden rooms sealed behind brick, of doors that did not appear on floor plans, of staircases that ended abruptly, as if designed to mislead rather than connect. Some claimed there were passages within the walls themselves, narrow spaces large enough for a person to move through unseen. Whether these features truly existed mattered less than the fact that people believed they did. The house began to attract attention for the wrong reasons. Local newspapers hinted at its reputation without naming it directly. Stories circulated about children who refused to walk past it at night, about pets that became agitated near its gates, about lights seen in upper windows when the house was supposed to be empty. Nothing was ever proven. But Franklin Castle was becoming known not for what had happened, but for what might have happened. As time passed, the number of deaths associated with the house grew more difficult to dismiss. Former residents reported sudden illnesses. Domestic workers quit abruptly, offering vague explanations or none at all. Some claimed they heard voices calling their names from empty rooms. Others described the sensation of being watched from behind walls. Again, there was no evidence, only consistency. The house seemed to produce the same effect on different people across different years under different circumstances. Anxiety, unease, a desire to leave, and many did. By the early 20th century, Franklin Castle was no longer just a house with a tragic past. It was a structure with a reputation. People spoke of it cautiously, as if names themselves carried weight. Real estate listings avoided detail. Potential buyers hesitated. The stories began to take on sharper edges. Children murdered in secret rooms. Bodies hidden in walls. A tunnel leading from the basement to Lake Erie, used to remove evidence without being seen. No tunnel was ever found. No bodies were ever recovered. But the rumors persisted because the house made them plausible. Its architecture felt defensive, concealing, unwilling to explain itself. The heavy stone walls, the irregular layout, the narrow windows. Everything about Franklin Castle suggested separation rather than openness. It was easy to believe that something could be hidden there. At some point, the narrative shifted. The house was no longer discussed as the site of unfortunate deaths. It became labeled as something else entirely. Haunted, not in the cinematic sense, not with dramatic apparitions or violent manifestations, but haunted as an occupied by unresolved presence, a place where loss had accumulated without release. People claimed to hear children crying late at night. Others reported the sound of footsteps pacing empty rooms. Some spoke of doors opening and closing on their own, slowly, deliberately. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as suggestion and coincidence. But even skeptics felt uncomfortable inside the house. That was the problem. Franklin Castle did not need belief to function. It produced unease regardless of expectation. People who entered with curiosity left with relief. People who intended to stay rarely did. And expectation, when repeated often enough, becomes reality of its own kind. The stage was set. The house was no longer just holding the past. It was beginning to manufacture the future. At some point, fear stopped being a consequence of the house and became its function. By the middle of the 20th century, Franklin Castle was no longer treated as a residence with a troubled history. It was treated as a phenomenon, something to be investigated, exploited, tested. The question was no longer whether the stories were true, but how much attention they could generate. Ownership changed again, and with it, intention. The house began to attract people who were not looking for a home, but for validation. Paranormal investigators, sensational journalists, curiosity seekers, people who wanted proof, not understanding. Equipment was brought in. Night visits were staged. Sounds were recorded, interpreted, replayed. Every creak became evidence. Every draft became presence. Every shadow became intent. The house did not resist this transformation. It accommodated it. Franklin Castle had already been shaped by expectation for decades. Now expectation gave it a new role. Rooms once avoided were entered deliberately. Basements were searched for tunnels that never appeared. Walls were tapped and measured, looking for hollow spaces that might confirm old rumors. Nothing conclusive was ever found, but that no longer mattered. The absence of proof was reframed as mystery. The lack of answers became confirmation that something was being concealed. The house was no longer required to produce events. It only needed to remain ambiguous. And ambiguity was abundant. As the stories spread, they became sharper and more theatrical. The number of dead children grew with each retelling. Details solidified without sources. The idea of a murderer hiding bodies inside the walls became fixed in the public imagination, despite the complete absence of physical evidence. Franklin Castle became a container for everything people feared but could not verify. In time, the house was renamed. Franklin Castle gave way to the Castle of the Devil. The name stuck. It transformed the building from a site of tragedy into a spectacle. Tourists came not to understand its past, but to experience a feeling. Unease, fear, proximity to something forbidden. The house became less about what had happened and more about what might happen to you if you stepped inside. This was the final shift. The house had been built as a private residence. It became a suspected crime scene, then a haunted location. Now it was a brand. And like all brands built on fear, it required constant reinforcement. Stories were repeated, exaggerated, polished. Silence was no longer acceptable. The house had to perform. Owners and caretakers found themselves caught between two incompatible goals: preserving a historic structure and maintaining the narrative that made it valuable. Repairs were delayed because decay felt authentic. Darkness was preserved because light weakened the atmosphere. Truth became inconvenient. Over time, the house absorbed so many versions of itself that the original story nearly vanished. The Tiedemann family faded into background noise. Documented deaths were drowned out by invented ones. The lack of evidence was no longer a flaw, but a feature. Franklin Castle no longer needed history. It needed belief. And belief, once detached from fact, becomes remarkably durable. Even skeptics could not fully escape the effect. Many entered convinced the stories were nonsense. Many left unsettled anyway, not because they had seen anything, but because the house imposed a rhythm that felt off, proportions that felt wrong, spaces that seemed designed to observe rather than be observed. The architecture did the work. Stone does not need to lie. It only needs to remain. As the 20th century progressed, Franklin Castle survived periods of neglect, partial restoration, and renewed interest. Each phase added another layer to its identity, another interpretation, another reason for people to argue over what it was and what it meant. The house became crowded with narratives, all competing, none resolving. And beneath them all, the structure waited. Unreactive, unexplanatory, present. Franklin Castle had fully crossed the line from place to projection, from a building marked by loss into a surface onto which fear could be endlessly written. What came next would test whether the house could survive that weight. Because places built from stone can endure centuries. But places built from expectation eventually collapse under contradiction. And Franklin Castle was carrying too many stories to remain unchanged forever. Eventually, the weight of the stories became heavier than the building itself. Franklin Castle had survived decades of rumor, neglect, curiosity, and exploitation, but it had not escaped time. Stone cracked, wood weakened. Water found its way into places it had never been meant to reach. The house was no longer just a symbol of fear. It was a structure in need of intervention. And intervention threatened the legend. When serious restoration efforts began, they did so under tension. Every repair raised the same question: how much of the house could be saved without destroying the image that surrounded it? Fix too much, and the mystery evaporated. Fix too little, and the building would collapse under its own weight. This conflict defined the next phase of Franklin Castle's life. Architects and preservationists approached the structure as a historical artifact. They examined records, materials, timelines. They searched for evidence of hidden rooms, tunnels, secret chambers, not to confirm rumors, but to finally put them to rest. They found none. No tunnel to Lake Erie. No concealed mass graves. No architectural proof of systematic murder. What they found instead was something more ordinary and more uncomfortable. A house built in an era of excess, designed to intimidate rather than comfort, modified repeatedly over time by different owners. The castle's strangeness was real, but it was architectural, not criminal. This reality did not sit well with everyone. For those invested in the legend, restoration felt like erasure. Walls cleaned and stabilized lost their menace. Spaces once cloaked in shadow were measured, mapped, and explained. The house resisted transformation, not physically, but symbolically. It had become dependent on ambiguity. As renovations progressed, public reactions split sharply. Some welcomed clarity. Others accused caretakers of covering up the truth. Every rational explanation was reframed as deception. Every absence of evidence was taken as proof that something had been hidden too well. Franklin Castle was now trapped between two incompatible identities: a historic home deserving preservation, and a haunted icon that thrived on uncertainty. It could not fully be both. During this period, the house passed through multiple owners, each with different intentions. Some attempted to distance it from the supernatural narrative. Others leaned into it openly. Tours were rebranded. Stories were adjusted. Marketing replaced investigation. The house endured all of it. But something subtle changed. As more of its structure was stabilized, fewer people reported dramatic experiences. The sounds diminished. The atmosphere softened. The fear, once assumed to be intrinsic, began to feel conditional. Expectation mattered more than presence. Those who entered believing the house was dangerous felt uneasy. Those who entered skeptical noticed architecture, age, and silence. The house did not contradict either experience. It reflected them. Franklin Castle was not producing fear. It was amplifying it. And amplification requires input. As the decades moved forward, interest waxed and waned. New generations encountered the house without the same cultural baggage. For them, it was less a place of horror and more a curiosity, a strange old building with a long story attached. The legend did not disappear, but it weakened, and that weakening forced a final reckoning. Because once a place is fully explained, fully mapped, fully stabilized, it must choose what it is going to be. A myth cannot survive indefinitely under inspection, and Franklin Castle was running out of places to hide. What remained was not the question of whether the house was haunted. What remained was not the question of whether the house was haunted, but whether the story surrounding it could survive without fear. In the end, Franklin Castle did not reveal a hidden room, a buried truth, or a final confession locked inside its walls. What it revealed instead was something quieter and far more durable. The house survived. It survived rumors that could never be proven. It survived decades of neglect and exploitation. It survived attempts to explain it away and attempts to sell it as something it was not. And through all of it, the structure remained stubbornly ordinary in the ways that mattered most. No tunnel was ever found leading to the lake. No evidence of systematic murder ever surfaced. No physical trace confirmed the darkest versions of the story. What remained were records of loss, architecture shaped by taste and era, and a sequence of deaths that, while tragic, were never conclusively connected to malice or crime. Franklin Castle did not keep secrets. People assigned them. Over time, the legends thinned. Not because they were disproven, but because repetition without discovery erodes belief. Each investigation that found nothing did not end the story. It simply made it less urgent. Fear lost its sharpness. Mystery lost its grip. The house settled into something more honest. A historic structure with a complicated past. A building burdened by stories larger than itself. A place where grief, coincidence, and imagination collided and hardened into myth. Visitors still feel something inside Franklin Castle. They still lower their voices. They still pause longer than necessary in certain rooms. But what they feel is not presence. It is context. Old buildings carry silence differently. Stone absorbs sound. Corridors bend perspective. Age removes the distractions that modern life depends on. When nothing is happening, the mind fills the space. Franklin Castle does not speak. It reflects. It reflects the human tendency to turn loss into narrative, to explain discomfort with danger, to turn absence into intention. When answers are unsatisfying, stories become substitutes. The house became famous not because it was uniquely terrible, but because it was uniquely available for interpretation. It stood in plain sight. It resisted easy explanation. It offered just enough strangeness to support whatever fears someone arrived with. That is how legends survive. Not through proof, through repetition. Today, Franklin Castle stands restored enough to endure, but unchanged enough to remain unsettling. It is neither a crime scene nor a shrine, neither a haunted attraction nor a neutral artifact. It occupies an uncomfortable middle ground, and that may be its most honest form. Because Franklin Castle was never about what happened inside it. It was about what people needed it to mean. About how communities process grief they cannot verify. About how architecture becomes a canvas for unresolved stories. The house did not create fear. It collected it. And once collected, fear is difficult to give back. Franklin Castle endures not as a warning or a mystery, but as a reminder that places do not become dark on their own. They become dark when enough people agree they should be. The stone remains. The stories fade and return. And the house continues to stand, quiet, solid, and finally finished only in the sense that nothing more needs to be added. Not because the truth was hidden, but because it was simpler than anyone wanted it to be.